She didn't know it was the last night she would ever feel invisible. She didn't know that the borrowed gown, a whisper of dove-gray silk that her mother had called funereal, was the last garment of subjugation she would ever wear. She didn't know that the ache in her soul, a hollow space carved out by years of quiet dismissals and sharp-edged words, was about to be filled to overflowing. All Alara knew was the crushing weight of the grand hall, the way the crystal chandeliers dripped honeyed light onto people who shimmered with a confidence she could only imagine. The air was thick with the scent of hothouse flowers and cloying perfume, a suffocating sweetness that mirrored the smiles of the courtiers. Her smile was a fragile thing, a shield she held up against the casual cruelty of her own family, East. She stood near a marble column, trying to merge with the cold stone, to become just another part of the castle's architecture. It was a skill she had perfected over 20 years, to be present but unseen, to listen but not be heard, to exist in the margins of her own life. Her sister, Lyra, was the center of this world. Tonight, she was a supernova in emerald green, her laughter cutting sharper than any blade as she held court near the fountain. Their mother, Lady Seraphina, stood beside her, a proud hawk guarding her prized fledgling. Every glance Seraphina sent Alara's way was a tiny, sharp stone, reminding her of her place. You are the shadow that proves the sun is shining. That was what her mother had told her once, her voice a silken caress hiding a viper's fang. Alara's gaze drifted past them to Lord Cassian. He had been her fiancé once, a lifetime ago it seemed, before he had seen the brighter prize in Lyra and had cast Alara aside with the careless ease of a man discarding a worn glove. Now he stood beside Lyra, his hand on the small of her back, his posture a declaration of ownership. He caught Alara's eye and gave her a small, pitying smirk. It was a look that said, "You see? This is where the real power is. You were never enough." She turned away, her spine straight, her chin held at an angle that spoke of a dignity they could not touch. They could break her heart, but they could not break her spirit. Not entirely. A tiny, defiant ember still glowed in the ashes of her hope. She focused on the intricate tapestries lining the walls, on the way the moonlight slanted through the high arched windows, finding beauty where she could. It was her only escape. She felt a shift in the room's atmosphere before she saw it. A silence rippled out from the grand entrance, a sudden hush that swallowed the music and the chatter. A presence had arrived, a power so immense it bent the very air around it. From his throne on the dais, King Theron of the Northern Realms had been watching the glittering assembly with a profound and soul-crushing boredom. He had refused 17 marriage proposals in the last month alone. He had listened to endless sycophants praise his wisdom, his strength, his lineage, all while their eyes held the glint of avarice. They saw his crown, his lands, his power. Not one of them saw the man. He was weary, a deep, bone-gnawing weariness that came from a life of lonely duty. His kingdom was secure, his people prosperous, but his heart was a frozen territory, vast and empty. He had come to this ridiculous southern gala as a diplomatic courtesy, and he was counting the seconds until he could retreat to the cold, clean silence of his mountains. Paragraph. His gaze swept the room, cataloging the false smiles, the desperate ambition. Jewel tones blurred together. Laughter sounded like breaking glass. It was a sea of glittering emptiness. And then he saw her. Standing by a column, half hidden in shadow, was a woman who was not glittering at all. She was still, a point of quiet grace in a chaotic swirl of color and noise. Dressed in simple gray, She was like a pearl found amongst a trove of gaudy gems. While everyone else clamored for attention, she seemed to be actively deflecting it. But it was not shyness he saw in her posture. It was resilience. It was a strength forged in a fire he could only imagine. He watched as a striking woman in emerald green and a smug-looking lord shot her a look of pure malice. He saw the flicker of pain in the gray woman's eyes, a wound so deep it was almost invisible. And then he saw her straighten her spine, lift her chin, and face the room with a quiet courage that struck him like a physical blow. In that moment, something inside him, a lock he hadn't even known existed, clicked open. The boredom vanished, replaced by a fierce, startling clarity. It was a feeling of recognition, primal and absolute. A thread of fate spun in the darkness before time had just pulled taut. He had not been searching, but he had found. Alara felt it too, a sudden warmth that had nothing to do with the stuffy ballroom. It was a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, a feeling of being seen. Not just noticed, but truly, deeply seen. As if someone had peeled back all her layers of quiet sorrow and gazed directly at her soul. Her breath hitched. She scanned the crowd, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. Her eyes met his. He was across the room, seated on the royal dais, a figure of stark power in midnight blue. The Alpha King, King Theron. Legends surrounded him. They said he was carved from the glaciers of his homeland, that his heart was encased in ice, that his gaze could freeze a man's blood. But the eyes that held hers were not cold. They were the color of a stormy sea, deep and turbulent, and they burned with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. The world fell away. The music, the crowd, the weight of her mother's disapproval. It all dissolved into a meaningless hum. There was only the king on his throne and the invisible thread connecting them across the expanse of polished marble. Then he stood. The movement was fluid, decisive, a king who did not hesitate. The room held its collective breath. Every eye was on him, wondering which simpering debutante he would honor with his attention. Lyra preened, adjusting the emeralds at her throat, a confident smile playing on her lips. She was the most beautiful woman here. Of course, he was coming for her. But King Theron did not look at Lyra. He did not look at any of the hopeful, painted faces turned his way. His stormy gaze remained locked on Alara, and he began to descend the steps of the dais. The crowd parted for him. They were not an assembly of nobles. They were reeds in a river, bending before an unstoppable current. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and focused. He walked past dukes and duchesses. He walked past Lady Seraphina, who looked momentarily stunned. He walked past Lyra, whose triumphant smile faltered and cracked like thin ice. He walked past Lord Cassian, whose smug expression curdled into confusion. He stopped directly in front of Alara. He was taller than she had imagined, broader. He smelled of cedar and cold, clean air, a scent of the wild north that was a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the south. Close now, she could see the flecks of silver in his dark hair at the temples, the faint lines of weariness around his eyes that only made him look more formidable. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was exactly as the legends described it, like gravel wrapped in velvet. A low rumble that vibrated through the floor, through the soles of her simple shoes, and straight into her bones. For a moment, she couldn't find her own voice. All her practiced invisibility, all her careful shields, were useless against this man. He saw her. He was waiting. "Alara," she finally managed, her voice a little more than a whisper. Then, A spark of the defiance that had kept her from crumbling all these years flickered to life. Why would it matter to a king? A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a subtle shift that did not reach his eyes but softened the hard line of his mouth. It was not amusement. It was satisfaction. He had seen the steel beneath her quiet exterior, and her response had just confirmed it. "Because I have a feeling," he said, his voice dropping even lower, meant for her ears alone, "that it is the only name in this entire room worth knowing." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Disbelief warred with a terrifying surge of hope. He extended a hand. It was a large, strong hand, unadorned by rings save for a single, heavy silver signet bearing the crest of a wolf. It was not a request. It was an offer, a lifeline. "Come with me." She looked at his hand and then at his face. His expression was serious, unwavering. He was not playing a game. This was real. She looked over his shoulder at her family. She saw the shock on her mother's face, the open-mouthed fury on Lyra's, the utter bewilderment on Cassian's. For the first time in her life, she held all the power. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm. The contact was electric, a jolt of energy that shot up her arm and settled deep in her chest. He did not lead her to the dance floor as the whispering crowd expected. Instead, he turned and led her away from the suffocating heat of the ballroom, through a set of glass doors, and out onto a deserted, moonlit balcony. The cool night air was a balm on her heated skin. Below them, a labyrinth of sculpted hedges slept under a blanket of stars. The scent of night-blooming jasmine filled the air. The silence was a relief, broken only by the distant, muffled strains of the orchestra. He released her hand, but did not step away. He stood beside her, leaning against the stone balustrade, his presence a solid, grounding weight in the darkness. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Alara struggled to process what had just happened. It felt like a dream, and she was terrified of waking up. "I'm nobody," she said finally, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It was the truth that had been branded onto her soul. A shadow, the lesser daughter. "I don't understand." Theron turned to face her fully, his silhouette stark against the moon-drenched sky. "What I saw in that room was not a shadow," he said, his voice soft, but laced with an undeniable conviction. "I saw a woman standing in a storm, and while everyone else was dancing, she was the only one not being blown away. I saw strength you probably don't even see in yourself." Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and unfamiliar. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her and seen strength. They saw plainness. They saw a disappointment. "You don't know me," she whispered, shaking her head. "My own family barely tolerates my presence. The man who was supposed to marry me cast me aside for my sister because I wasn't enough." The confession left her feeling raw, exposed. "He was a fool," Theron stated, the words simple, flat, and absolute. "A blind man standing before a treasure, complaining that it does not glitter like glass. His opinion is worth less than the dust on my boots." He took a step closer. "I have been a king for 20 years, Alara. I have spent my life surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. Their smiles are weapons, and their praise is poison. I know the difference between polished stone and a true diamond. Do not tell me what they see. Tell me what you see." She looked up at him, at the sincerity etched onto his stern features. The weariness she had seen from across the room was still there, but now it was tempered by something else, a flicker of hope that mirrored her own. I see. A king, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The title felt immense, a chasm between them. The Alpha King of the North, a man of legends. That is my title, he said, dismissing it with a slight wave of his hand. It is the weight I carry. It is not who I am. Tonight, when I looked at you, I was not a king. I was just a man who has been walking through a barren land for a very long time, and has just found the only flower for 1,000 miles. The poetry of his words, so unexpected from this formidable, warlike king, undid her. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. Before she could wipe it away, he reached out, his thumb gently brushing it from her skin. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to his rugged appearance. It was a touch that cherished, that revered. Do not cry for what they have done to you, he murmured, his voice a low vibration against the night. They are not worthy of your tears. She found her courage then, a small, flickering flame fanned into life by his words. Then why me? Out of everyone in that room, why choose the one everyone else has thrown away? Because you were not thrown away, he corrected her, his gaze intense. You were hidden, and I have always been a good hunter. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent conversation passing between them. A promise, a question. Then he offered her his arm. We should return. I believe we have a statement to make. Walking back into the ballroom on the arm of King Theron was like entering an entirely different world. If his approach had caused a ripple, their return caused a tidal wave. The music faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. 1,000 pairs of eyes were fixed on them, on his hand resting possessively on hers. Elara kept her eyes forward, her hand gripping his arm as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. She could feel the heat of his body beside her, a fortress protecting her from the barrage of stairs. They had not taken 5 steps before they were intercepted. Lady Seraphina, Lyra, and Cassian stood before them, a united front of outrage and disbelief. Your Majesty, Seraphina began, her voice tight with a poorly concealed fury, her smile a brittle mask. I fear my youngest daughter has been bothering you. She can be naive. She doesn't understand her place. On the contrary, Theron's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Her place, for tonight, is by my side. Lyra stepped forward, her emerald gown shimmering. But, Your Majesty, surely you would prefer more stimulating company. My sister is terribly dull. She reads books. She said the last words as if it were a disease. Before Theron could respond, Cassian stepped forward, his face a mask of false concern. He placed himself directly in the king's path, a foolish, arrogant move. He looked at Theron, but his words were aimed like daggers at Elara. She's not worth your time, he warned, his voice loud enough for the surrounding nobles to hear. The ultimate humiliation, the final, public dismissal. Your Majesty, with all due respect, she's not worth your time. She is simple, broken. I would know. I was engaged to her once. There is a darkness in her, a melancholy. You can do so much better. The silence in the hall was absolute. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, threatening to shatter the fragile new hope that had just begun to bloom in her chest. She felt her old instincts kick in, to shrink, to disappear, to become invisible. But the arm she held was like granite, unmoving, unyielding. King Theron did not raise his voice. He did not look at Cassian. His terrifyingly calm gaze remained fixed on a point over the Lord's shoulder. He simply stood there for a long, drawn-out second, letting the insult hang in the air, letting its poison spread, letting everyone see the man who had dared to utter it. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he turned his head and looked down at Alara. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent message of reassurance. I am here. I am not leaving. He then turned his attention back to the room, but not to Cassian. He ignored the Lord as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. His gaze swept over the royal table, the place of highest honor. And he acted. He released Alara's arm, took 2 steps toward the head of the table, and with a quiet scrape of wood on marble, he pulled out her chair anyway. It was the chair to his right, the seat of the guest of honor, the seat of a queen. The gesture was so simple, so profound, it echoed in the cavernous hall louder than any shout. It was a dismissal of Cassian, a refutation of her family, and a declaration to the entire world. He turned back to Alara, his hand extended once more, his expression unreadable, but his eyes blazing with a cold fire. She walked toward him, her legs unsteady, moving through a sea of shocked faces. She took his hand, and he gently guided her to the chair, seating her as if she were the most precious treasure in his kingdom. He pushed her chair in, his hands resting for a moment on her shoulders, a silent claim. Only then did he turn to face her tormentors. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. Lord Cassian, he began, and the man flinched as if struck. You are right about one thing. You would know. You would know what it is to be in the presence of something fine and mistake it for something simple. You would know what it is to hold a jewel in your hand and call it a stone. Your blindness will be your legacy. He then shifted his gaze to Lyra and Seraphina. You speak of her place. Let me be clear. Her place is wherever she wishes it to be. You speak of her worth. From this moment on, her worth is tied to mine. Any disrespect shown to her is a direct and unforgivable insult to me and to the Northern Crown. I suggest you remember that. He let the threat hang in the air, a promise of ruin more potent than any army. Seraphina's face was ashen. Lyra looked as though she had been slapped. Cassian stood frozen, his face a mottled canvas of shock and dawning horror as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Their social standing, their entire world, had just been dismantled by a few quiet words and a single chivalrous gesture. Theron did not wait for a response. He took his own seat beside Alara, and then, in front of the entire court, in front of her humiliated family and her disgraced ex-fiancé, he turned to her. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. You are not broken, he murmured, his voice now filled with a fierce tenderness that was for her alone. You are magnificent. And he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming. It was fierce and deep and full of the promise of snow-covered mountains and roaring fires. It was a kiss that burned away years of pain and filled the hollow spaces inside her with light and warmth. It was the kiss of a king who had found his queen, a soul who had found its match. When he pulled away, she was breathless, and the entire world had been remade. Later that night, far from the whispers of the court, they stood in the quiet solitude of his private chambers. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the tapestries of wolves and mountains that adorned the stone walls. Alara traced the rim of a goblet, her mind still reeling. I still don't understand, she said, her voice soft. Why go to such lengths for a stranger? Theron came to stand behind her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders, his warmth seeping into her. "You were never a stranger, Alara," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The moment I saw you, I felt a recognition, as if my soul had been waiting and just saw its counterpart across a crowded room. Everything they said about you, dull, simple, quiet, was everything I have been searching for. I am so tired of the noise, of the performance. Your quiet was not emptiness. It was peace." He turned her to face him, his hands sliding down to hold hers. "My life is one of duty, of hard decisions and lonely nights. I rule a kingdom, but I have no home, not a true one." His stormy eyes searched hers. "I am not offering you protection for a night, Alara. I am not playing a courtly game. I am offering you a life, a home, with me, in the North." It was more than a proposal. It was a plea. The all-powerful Alpha King was showing her his own vulnerability, his own loneliness. "My home is yours, if you will have it," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had likely never shown another living soul. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy, of overwhelming, heart-stopping relief. The ember of hope inside her roared into a blazing inferno. "Yes," she whispered, the word a prayer. "Yes." 3 months later, Alara awoke to the soft, gray light of a northern dawn, filtering through the tall, arched window of their bedchamber. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and snow. Outside, the vast expanse of the frostwood was blanketed in pristine white. The silence deep and profound. She was no longer in a gilded cage. She was in a fortress, a sanctuary. She was home. She turned in the massive bed, the heavy fur blankets pooling around her. Theron was still asleep, his rugged face softened in repose. The lines of weariness around his eyes seemed fainter these days. She reached out and gently traced the sharp line of his jaw. His eyes fluttered open, the color of the sea waking to the sun. A slow, warm smile spread across his face, a smile she had come to learn was reserved only for her. "Good morning, my heart," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. He pulled her against him, his arms a familiar, welcome weight. Her laughter was a sound that was still new to her, bright and effortless. It was a sound he had given back to her. "Good morning, Your Majesty." He groaned. "Must you be so formal when we are tangled in furs?" "It is good to remind the king of his station," she teased, her confidence a comfortable cloak she now wore with ease. In the past 3 months, she had blossomed. The quiet, resilient woman was still there. But she was no longer shrouded in shadow. She had found her purpose, not just as Theron's partner, but as a respected figure in her own right. The people of the North, wary at first of the Southern woman their king had brought home, had been won over by her quiet wisdom and genuine kindness. She had taken charge of the great royal library, a place long neglected, and had begun the painstaking work of restoring ancient texts and histories. She advised Theron, not on matters of war or statecraft, but on the hearts of his people, an area where his own heart had long been closed. She was not his queen in title yet, but she was the heart of his kingdom. Later that day, a letter arrived bearing a southern seal. It had been forwarded from her old home. Her name was written on the front in Lyra's dramatic, looping script. Theron watched her as she took it, his expression carefully neutral. She broke the seal and read. It was exactly what she expected. A pathetic, rambling missive filled with hollow apologies and thinly veiled pleas. Their family's reputation was in ruins. Lord Cassian was a social pariah. Lyra wrote of her misery, of how unfair it all was, and begged Elara to speak to the king on their behalf, to restore their standing. There was no real remorse for her cruelty, only regret for its consequences. A year ago, this letter would have devastated her. 6 months ago, it would have filled her with a bitter, righteous anger. Now she felt nothing. A quiet, calm distance. The people who had written this letter were strangers to her now, ghosts from a life that no longer belonged to her. They had no power over her. She looked up at Theron, who had been watching her face intently. "It's from my sister," she said simply. "What does she want?" he asked, his voice carefully devoid of judgment. "Forgiveness," Elara said, "and a favor." She held the letter out to him. He took it, his eyes scanning the page. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He looked back at her, his stormy eyes asking the unspoken question. "What do you want to do?" She walked over to the great stone hearth where a fire burned brightly against the winter chill. She took the letter back from him, held it over the flames for a moment, and then let it go. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The past was gone. Theron came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I once thought my life was destined to be a long, cold winter," he said, his voice a quiet rumble against her back. "And then you came. You are my spring, Elara. You are the sun that thawed the ice." She leaned back into his embrace, her heart full to bursting. All the pain, all the lonely years had been worth it. They had been the path that led her here, to this man, to this life. She was not the invisible girl by the column anymore. She was not the broken thing her ex-fiancé had tried to name her. "And you?" she whispered, turning her head to kiss him. A slow, deep kiss full of love and gratitude. "You are the one who finally taught me how to fly." He held her tighter, and in the warm, quiet castle, surrounded by a kingdom of ice and snow, the overlooked jewel and the Alpha King had found there forever. She was not just valued, she was invaluable, and she was finally home.